Thank you for coming. My name is Patrick Masson. I am, excuse me, um, the executive director of the Apereo Foundation. Um, Before that, in my career, I was the chief information officer at the State University of New York and the chief information, I said that, State University of New York, but, and CTO at University of Massachusetts. So I've been working at the intersection of higher education and open source for about 30 years, starting off at UCLA as a programmer analyst, where we used to put in free software under the nose of campus system administrators. So a little bit about Apereo. We've been around for about 25 years. If you consider the two organizations, JSIG and Sakai Foundation, that started in around 2000, 12 years later, Apereo was formed when those two organizations merged. We have currently 13 active projects that are developed around the world. Uh, Contributors from Japan, Australia, throughout Europe. We have collaborators, almost just over 8,000 collaborators, so they're not technical folks, but they're instructional designers, researchers, faculty.
Sorry, pardon the interruption. I just
Uh,
want to check on something.
no worries. I need all the checking I can get.
Okay. So, mic is on. Close. Okay, I think you're good.
Am I good?
Yeah.
Should I be more booming?
Uh,
Volume over here?
that'll be for the room.
Oh.
This is the feed we're sending to our,
Yeah.
the
There's no one watching online.
But if you do project a little more,
Better.
great.
Okay. I'll use my hockey voice.
It's so early in the morning.
Right. So 8,000 contributors that are, like I said, faculty, instructional designers, researchers. We get participation from not only higher ed, but also industry that's using open source tools that Apereo develops that's engaged. So it's a pretty active community and with a long-standing history of both open source and higher ed experience. Um, and so as I've been working both in higher ed and for the last 12, 15 years in open source, prior to Apereo, I was the general manager at the Open Source Initiative. Um, Open source is sort of, as Wired magazine said in, I think, 2012, open source is one. We all see these statistics about the ubiquity and prevalence of open source software across industries. And so the real question for us was, what's the adoption rate and use and development of open source in higher education? And there aren't any real research around that, specifically looking at education technologies. And so we have some assumptions that we brought into this research. One is that I just mentioned open source software is everywhere across every industry. I think that's sort of a general consensus that nobody's really arguing that. The development and adoption of open source software in higher education should mirror that. So wouldn't it be interesting if the only industry that's not using open source software was higher ed? But do they know if they are or not? Increasing interest requirements, regulations. So there's all sorts of things that are happening outside the institution or off campus. You can look at software bill of materials, and there's even a U.S. Senate bill about open source. There's the CRA in Europe. There's NSF, NIH, federal guidelines about the use of open source in research. There's increasing grant opportunities. There's a lot of open source activity happening that should impact campuses. And if campuses aren't aware of how much open source software they're using, are they being left out, left behind? And that's the last one, lack of awareness and open source. These are assumptions coming into this that we're hoping to find out. So our objectives were to understand current perceptions of IT leaders. So what does the CIO, CTO, IT director, provost, research directors, what do they think about open source? And to describe the demand. Where is the current utilization of open source happening? Is it in libraries? Is it in research? Define applicability. How are they using these tools? Discover trends. Are they interested? Are they fading? Who's getting involved? Who's leading development? Who's leading adoption? Where are these going? And then finally, opportunities for the universities. How can they best leverage their engagement with open source to take advantage of the communities and best support their campuses. So that's sort of what we were thinking about. So we boiled this down to 4 research questions. As I mentioned, what's the perception of open source software amongst IT leaders? And we'll have a discussion on what a leader is on campus. Brian, obviously, is one. What open source software is currently deployed? So can we find out what they're really running on campuses? What level of development is underway? And that would be looking at GitHub or GitLab or research activity, what's being developed in the IT shop, those sorts of things, and what campus roles are in play. So if you're hiring a Python developer or Kubernetes admin or I don't know, whatever, you must be running some open source somewhere because you're hiring for these people. I hope you're not hiring them just so they can hold the door open. But in this part, through our long efforts, we only really got the first 2 done at this point. So we've got the first 2 that I'm presenting today, the perception of open source software among higher ed IT leaders and what's actually deployed. And we reached out to a variety of organizations, one just as an endorsement that we think this is a good idea, and some of them actually contributed with finding prior work, doing sort of a literature review of surveys and other data that was out there already, because we wanted to do a historical reflection or reflect on historical numbers as well. So folks were involved in a variety of ways to actually, from actually contributing to just saying, hey, this is a good idea, we'd be interested in participating or getting the results. So we did that landscape survey of prior work, and we found 5 resources that we thought were fairly significant. The first one I was really impressed with was a long-running survey that just ended from Kenneth Green, the Campus Computing Project. That ran from 2004 to 2019. I don't know why it ended, but it was a pretty comprehensive and often referenced document over its time. The first one I found was the CIO Constituent Group Survey by Scott Siddell. That was the first survey I could see of a higher ed survey specifically related to open source use. And there are some others that were cross-industry. For example, the government, what are they called? Governance Business Council did a report on government's interest in open source. And I thought government would be a good sort of peer industry, public-facing, same sort of bureaucratic hassles. Often universities are public anyway. So looking at their results might be a way to just also provide some analysis across industries comparing to what higher ed is doing. So this is the prior work, and I apologize for this is not one of my children's scribbles. So the blue line is just to sort of set a baseline, and this is just Google Trends of what open source interest generally across whatever Google does to identify how popular searches are. And that's sort of just a trend line to see what's the global perception of open source at this time over this period. So from 2004 to 2024, the first bar there is, and this is just looking at engagement. How engaged is open source, or how engaged is higher ed in open source at the time? So the first one was from Scott Siddell that I mentioned previously, and this question was just, are you using open source? So it's just a very vague question, and you can see the reporting there. Next after that is IMS Global, which is a standards body. They also did a survey, and there are 2 lines there is, are you using it, and is it mission critical, in a mission critical role? So you can see 42%, 41% think it's mission critical, or using it in some mission critical capacity, and 60% are using it in some other way. The black bars are all Kenneth Green's work over time, and again, are you using it? Light gray. Black is mission critical, and gray is at enterprise level. So this was sort of like, well, somebody on campus is using it, so it's present on campus. Gray, the light gray or the medium gray is central IT is using it, and black gray is it's being used in a mission critical state. And then you can see in 2014, They changed the question in the campus computing project to just, is it being used on is it mission critical on campus? The red lines is, again, just sort of a test of how much discussion is happening. That's the EDUCAUSE content. So those are articles, posts, anything in the EDUCAUSE. Are folks familiar with EDUCAUSE at all? So just real quickly, EDUCAUSE is the .edu domain administrator, and they also have a professional organization comprised of, I'll talk a little bit more about EDUCAUSE, but like 1,800 universities around the world that are members, 7,000 individual members. They're the primary IT professional organization for higher education. So their body of work covering open source in that time is reflected in the red, and that's actual count of how many articles were published over the year at that time. So the peak in 2009 was 55 articles relating to open source in some way. The green is conference sessions, so that's how many presentations at the annual conference were in on open source. And then yellow is an EDUCAUSE survey. Google is the last one is searching open source within .edu domains over time. So the lines represent sort of trends, and the bars indicate activity reported by campuses. And you can see that open source sort of came on with a bang. We had I guess 2012 was the year that Wired magazine said open source won, and the year of the MOOC. 2012 was, for those in campus IT, 2012 was the year Canvas was released and under open source fanfare. Pearson Publishing had Open Class released at EDUCAUSE with open source fanfare. So the year of open source was 2012. And over that time, you can see that interest and activity in open source in higher ed has sort of tailed off. However, Synopsys, which you can take for their report on this, Synopsys does threat assessment and wants to get everyone scared about so that they can get jobs coming in and telling you how vulnerable or whatever you are in your company. But they do a security and risk report, and as part of that report, they look at how much open source software is in different industries' software. So this is edtech, and this graph here shows, this was in 2022, but I did also pull from the 2024 report the 95 and 87%. And the higher number is the percentage of code bases containing open source. So and then the lower number is the percentage of code in code bases that was open source. So, this has, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but the idea is that the 100 applications reviewed, and 90 of them had some sort of open source software in it, and so on. But we'll get to this. But so then I mapped this to the same graph that was before, and you can see that while we're talking less about open source in EDUCAUSE and on campus, and campus engagement seems to be less, the actual adoption and use, as reported at least by Synopsys, is nearly 100% of open source software. So even if you're not running open source software like WordPress or Drupal or Moodle or Sakai or something on your campus, the vendors and commercial providers that are providing you your most important core services and platforms and software all have open source software. So if those trusted providers are running open source, your campus is running open source, whether you know it or not. So how much open source software our campus is using? So this is the information about EDUCAUSE. I want to highlight, this is a preliminary survey. This was just sort of a gut check on, are the questions we're asking correct? Is the audience we're going to ask correct? Does it make sense? If everyone did this survey, it was all gobbledygook at the end, we want to start over. So this is a very narrow window that we surveyed folks during the EDUCAUSE annual conference in October of 2024, just last year. So a little bit about EDUCAUSE, as I mentioned, 1,800 institutional members. I'm sorry, 100,000 active professionals. I've definitely got that number wrong. And then at the EDUCAUSE annual conference in 2024, it was 10 days of activities. That's when we ran the survey. We limited the survey to the folks in what they call community groups. There's an openness and a CIO community group. There are 4,300 members in those two groups. We estimated there were just under 2,500 attendees from the group, and we got 159 responses from those. That group that we targeted. There's the background of the folks that we asked, and also the profiles of the institutions that responded. So, with a grain of salt, here's the preliminary results. And again, did we ask the right people? Were the findings that were interesting? Because if we didn't find anything interesting, is it really worth doing the bigger survey? So this was our initial sort of just testing of the waters. So the backgrounds that people had, the roles they had on campus, were varied. So individuals reported having multiple roles as an end user, obviously, but in some sort of support provider, whether that's an administrator of a system or a help desk and so on. So it was a broad group of, most individuals had more than one role, it looks like, that they were playing on their campus. And then where were they in the campus? So most were in support and maintenance of software and services. So some IT role, I suspect. There's management folks, not that many. I guess those are the few CIOs who took the time to fill out our survey. So one question might be, how can we engage better with senior leadership, and so on. And then this is the question is, how are you involved in your institution's selection or procurement or acquisition of software? So these are the roles they played. They might have developed requirements. They might have evaluated it. They might have been recommending. So this is, again, just to sort of see how involved these folks were with open source or with just software activities on their campus. And then we asked also basically what the perception is of open source and for this group on campus, and compared that. This is the first sort of cross comparison with the survey coming out of government. And these are just the responses. We haven't, just for comparison, to sort of level check the level of engagement and interest. So there seems to be relatively a similar amount of engagement, but looking at the government report, you'll see a lot more awareness and activity. We'll get to that later, comparing IT staff or respondents from the higher ed community versus respondents to the government. So this is sort of the takeaways here. 74% were engaged in use. And again, I think that reflects that this community, at least, knew that they are somehow engaged with an open source tool, and that might have been just because they were from the openness CG community group, and so they were probably a little bit more aware of what's going on campus. I don't know if the average campus user might have known that, and then that group also had 61% were actually providing support and maintenance. So again, this group was intimately aware. So for later on, these are interesting numbers to consider about some of the activity that's happening on campus. It looks like this group is pretty familiar with the open source activity happening on campus, which I think might be a better group to ask than folks that might not have really any IT or software or ed tech experience on campus. They're just faculty, staff working every day on things. And if anyone has any questions along the way, that's fine too. So next was the institutional landscape. So now this is where that group is reporting what's happening on their campuses. And we're comparing this to information that came out from 2006 2006 and 2007, again from the Kenneth Green Campus Computing Project. And you can see here where open source software is being used on campus, or its state. Like, where is it in the pipeline? So you can see in the mission critical today in education, it's actually much higher than ever, being reported much higher than ever than previous surveys. There's really no, I mean, I guess there's a few that are There it is. You can take a look at it and tell me what you think. This is comparing 2007 and 2024 investments in open source software. So again, the group's reporting. This is open source software important to academic and research institutions to create their own open source software? So the idea of customization and use of software for the unique needs of higher education. You can see that the shift there is from 2004 over the 20 years. Seems to be a recognition or agreement there strongly. And then, does your institution have a clear IT strategy regarding the use and development of open source software? And again, comparing 2004, 7, and 8 versus today. So I think the primary takeaway for me on this one was that while there's a lot of people involved in campuses in open source software, there's a recognition that open source provides provides for unique needs. Investment has remained about the same, and 60% of campuses report that open source software is in production now on campuses. There's no IT strategy on open source software. So is this all like shadow IT? Is it all under the desk somewhere? Is it all researchers who have their own grant and are working outside IT? Where is this and how is this happening? And what kind of vulnerabilities and risks should that could that present to central IT, to the campus at large? And so now the future impact. So this was asking respondents on the future. Will open source become more important over time? And it was interesting here that most respondents sort of think, yes, it's going to on my campus, but everyone else must be doing it better than we are, and they're going to be engaged more than we are. So comparing their local campus perspective to what they think is happening on other campuses, there is a big, not a big difference, but there was a difference. So, I don't know what that means right now again, but I do think it's an interesting perspective. And then you compare this to government, and even both situations are less than what the government respondents had said about the increasingly important role of open source within their institution, government, or education. And then comparing this back, however, to 2004 and 2007 to the Campus Computing Project, where 53% in 2007 and 52% or 57% and 52% respectively thought it'd be important. Today, it's still much higher than when open source was first coming out. So again, there seems to be this general awareness of the value and the importance and the relevancy of open source software from the respondents within higher ed. So this is investment in open source software versus today. So in 2007, there is a greater perception that the investment would increase versus today. Is that because at the time there was less open source software, so campuses felt that they were going to have to invest in it, versus today where it's sort of up and running and they don't need to invest as much anymore? And this is toward the future, so today versus looking out to the future. And again, the perception that it's going to either remain the same or, in this case, increase more, is this just an informed community that responded that because they're working more and more, they see more and more that the campuses should invest more in it, more and more that's coming on. This is looking at current areas of software systems, and the gray bar is compared to the 2008 survey from IMS Global. And this is so where is open source going to be deployed, invested in? Respondents felt it was going to increase most in infrastructure. That's probably not surprising. Academic, then administrative computing. And so the trends here sort of follow consistently as reported back in 2008 and 2024. Brian's got a look on his face. And this is the areas, so desktops, libraries, what area on campus do they feel? For those in research-focused OSPOs, they might like to see that the 2024 respondents felt that science and research was going to be the area most invested in open source. So 75% believe that there was an increasingly important role. 31% thought there'd be greater investment. Interestingly, nobody thought that open source was going to drop in adoption. Yeah, Nate.
Just about like the terminology in that previous graph, you said science and research. Is that how it was phrased?
Right.
I'm kind of curious what's included because historical research could use open source too.
Historical research could use.
I don't know, like archaeology. A lot of things that are research that are not necessarily been.
So it was broken up into academic computing, research computing, administrative computing. So if the software is being used to deliver an online course, I'm assuming someone would say, oh, we use this, so it's academic computing. Oh, we're using, Python or something in my research. No, so if you're doing research in education and you were using an open source survey tool, they might say that, oh yeah, we're using. I'm assuming I know what the people who are filling out the survey were thinking. But, oops. So that was sort of the perception of the IT leaders, our folks involved in IT. Generally, I think that there's an increase of interest in open source. Open source is running on campuses, but there's not really any policies or practices to support the identification, development, management of open source on software. Open source software on campuses. So the second thing we did is we looked at what's actually running on campuses, and I wanted to be careful not to say, look, we're not asking everyone to say, oh, there's no open source on campus. I don't want to upset a lot of the campus IT leadership and say, no, we don't do any of that stuff, and then come back with, oh, look how much you're running. But I sort of do want to say that. So I do want to say, look, you should be aware of what you're actually running on campus. So I don't know if folks are, Frank Nagel at Harvard Business School has done several, and his students have done several reports on open source value and so on. And through that research, I discovered Built With. I don't know if folks already know Built With. I hadn't heard of it before this. And I found some other references in relatively recent research that also use Built With. So that's good enough for me. And we use Built With, which goes out and actually hits all. You can give it. I think they primarily use it for a marketing tool to see, if you want to start selling services to a company and you support this, you can see what's running what and then hit them up for a job. So they we did a scan of 348,000 plus websites to identify .edu domains. So we can then query those to see what's running on those campuses. I'll note that .edu tends to be a North American, so if you're in the UK and you're in ac.uk, I recognize that these won't be, your institution won't be in there. But again, this is preliminary. Will this work? Are we asking the right kind of questions? And then we used OpenLogic, did a report with open source survey, and they identified a variety of popular open source software, including in education. So that's where we got the list to query. These are popular open source, at least identified by OpenLogic, that would be on campuses. These were the tools that were both in OpenLogic's index and also in Built With's search database that you could look up. So we sort of merged those to see what we could do. We could get more, but and we could ask for custom searches, but that costs a lot of money. And to be honest, part of this preliminary work is to show that this might be interesting, and then we can go up and hit up organizations to help sponsor this so we can get the funding to do more in-depth and more targeted research questions. But this is what, just again, to see what was running out there. And these were the most popular. So these are number of campuses that were running these tools. So I don't know if I said it. There were 520 5,259 .edu domains that were queried in this report. And of those 5,000 or so, 4,300 were running jQuery, and those are campuses, not installations. So this was found at least on one campus. I don't know if your favorite tool is up there or not. So we found that 89% of campuses queried of that 5,000, those 5,200 plus were running at least one open source application that was on that list. I'll add that if you notice, there wasn't any sort of Linux or MySQL, Postgres, anything farther down. There used to be a company called Netcraft. Well, the company still exists, and they used to actually go in there and they would run a report, and you could see what everything was running. But that was like 25 years ago, before sort of probing ports was probably not, seen as the risk that it is today. So they don't offer that service anymore. So these don't have those systems on there. So they might be running Nginx and some Linux flavor, but we didn't capture that. So these are only end user-facing applications like a learning management system, content management system, student portal, student information system, things that you can just see and be able to tell just by loading the page that it's an open source tool. So 92% of campuses were running the most popular jQuery. We found in total on those 5,000 campuses, 26,306 installations of some open source tool. So that's, I think, 6 per campus. And there are 74 out of the 76 that we collected and merged from OpenLogic's survey with the available queries from Built With. 74 out of 76 were present. So the key takeaways are, at least from the respondents that we had, that open source is mature and deeply embedded across the institution. And it's sort of is it challenging the notion that it's a enterprise-wide decision to deploy open source, or are these sort of bottom-up, under-the-table shadow IT activities? There's increasing adoption and a recognition of the value of open source, and so that, with the other takeaway in this, really again raises the questions: what's campus's IT policy or for open source? And even if they have one, why was it that 60% of the respondents didn't know about it? And then finally, the open source is prevalent on its institutions and deployed across, if you look back at that, the actual tools, it was everything from online learning to student information systems and of course all the sort of JavaScript and other sort of like, who knows what they're using those for. They could be anything from just something that's being pulled from some sort of proprietary application that's using an open source library or something, or it could be a locally developed tool. We don't know. But again, they do span the Moodle versus WordPress and so on, shows that there's a variety of uses of open source across the system. So these are sort of some of the problems that we have with this general work. I would never publish this or submit this to a journal or anything, because it's, again, was just preliminary to see if we're going the right way, if it's worth following up without too much of investment. We want to get more engaged with our co-authors. I think there's a lot more research out there that's going on that we don't know about yet. I just discovered that the University of California is doing some research. Can we partner with them? We want to get more contributors, folks that are actually working with us to, like Built With, or the companies that can review jobs that are out there right now. If you go to like Indeed or higheredjobs.com, can we pull the jobs that you're looking for, a Python developer or a Linux administrator or something like that? It'd be interesting to get those with it. So looking for more contributors, what we're calling contributors. And finally, sponsors. We need to find people to help us pay for this. So we're if we can build this compelling argument just through this preliminary data, this is worthy of future investigation and more qualified investigation, then maybe we can get some sponsors, either from grants or companies that are interested in also learning about the adoption and development of open source in higher ed. The respondents, are we hitting the right community? We just hit EDUCAUSE. Was it a self-selected group? Oh, these are all the open source people. So of course they're going to know, and of course they're going to be interested. But is that the right community within EDUCAUSE? And then are there other communities? I'd be interested, can we work with the OSPOs and they have their communities and hit them up? Can we work with projects that are on campuses and maybe they have a community? So who are these folks and how can we work with them? Can we work with other foundations? Python Software Foundation, Python obviously being a well represented community in higher ed. And then what are the numbers that make this legitimate so that it's not just 159 people over 10 days in one place and so on. So those are where we know our slip is showing and, where we would like help in any way. But that's where we are now with this, and happy to take any questions or arrows or tomatoes, or you want to question my research methodology and my so any questions, topics? Oh, thanks. Or you can just applaud. That's also
Just applaud.
yeah. One.
I'm doing my funny face.
Oh, here I think they want you to.
Doing micro.
So that the international community can hear your
Okay.
question.
Can you do me a favor and in the future try to split out open community from open source? Because there's a certain vendor on there who is the LMS of choice of higher education. And the vast majority of people don't give a crap that it's open source.
Oh, you mean Canvas?
You said a word, like I don't know what that word is, but hypothetically, if there's,
So I
if
was
there's a vendor product and they just basically are open source to check a box, but nobody really contributes to it, is
Yeah.
it relevant that it's open source? Would be
So-
my criticism.
I mean, it's an open core. It's my favorite. And if Bradley were here, he might throw a stone at me, but it's an AGPL open core thing. So, I mean, technically, I think it comes up as an open source. I'm just reporting but you and I can have a beer and have lots of nice things to say about open core business models in higher ed.
Well, I have no problem with the business model. It's
I
just,
do. Vendor lock-in.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's not terribly different from like other LMSs that are proprietary.
Yeah, I don't. Is that a
But
good
yeah,
thing?
that's the whole but that's the whole like sphere.
Yeah.
So I would just be curious as to what the stats look like when people take. I mean, I assume people are lumping that into critical infrastructure
Or
would think.
academic computing. Yeah.
or academic. Yeah, that I would be.
To
curious as
Nate's
to
point, how well, and this is a fair criticism of the thing. How well are we describing what academic and we didn't have a big blurb in front. These are the tools that qualify as academic and administrative. So that's great point. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't want to get start bashing, but I will.
Are you going to make the results of this research available? And if so, I would make a comment that it would be really useful, I think, to present it as like, here's a package for like lobbying at your university. Here's like an advocacy tool that anyone can pick up and use.
I had thought of that. I mean, I don't know if I'm embarrassed by this. I mean, this was done really as just testing the waters. So I think, I think that's a great way to present it. I think I feel more comfortable presenting it as preliminary marketing and not. The goal is from this was to see if there was enough interesting information and could solicit interest from others to turn into something more respectable. So I'd be happy to do that, but I also wouldn't want anyone hanging their career hat on this to say, going up to the president's office and saying, damn it, you should. I think the next one is what we would want to do. But, we're just this little old open source organization trying to build a community of interest around this.
You can make it open and give people the opportunity to contribute and make it better.
It is right now. We have a site that, and I should have put that on here, but I can share that with but everything is open. It's on a wiki, all the questions, how we merge the questions from the different surveys to see which are similar questions, people who've committed or contributed prior work. So it's all open and everyone can use it. The questions are there. It's just, again, I realize it's not high quality, high fidelity. So
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm trying to be as humble about this as possible and not. Anything else? Oh.
You know, just kind of follow up on Virginia's point too, is I know looking at it from the OSPO perspective that I mean, even just the preliminary data is super useful because I think that we're all looking at it as this weird black box, even for those of us who have decent relationships with our ITS departments and our research software folks. It's useful to go, hey, like point to some of what you brought up. So yeah, and then also like as a way of getting them more involved in the co-authorship. So I know like we're technically listed as a co-author, like UCSC, but I think it'd be even cooler if I could get my ITS folks, not just the OSPO, but the ITS folks like involved in this discussion, like and review. So you're getting it from their perspective as well. So I definitely, now that there's like the data and the presentation and stuff, it's really nice to be able to point to this. And I forgot, have you talked to Curious much about this, or folks from Curious yet about this?
No.
Because I think you'll get like a huge amount of interest from that group as well.
The one area that I would have more confidence in sharing, like as like this is really happening, is this information here, because this was pulled from the same data that the other research was done, the same tool that generated the data for the other research. So going to your IT department and say, look at how much open source, because theoretically they might be in here. You see Santa Cruz, you see Santa Barbara, Penn State. I don't know if there's other folks from other universities that they might be in here. And actually when you pull up the data for these and build with, you can see all the campuses that are running this. So you theoretically could look at the 2,746 WordPress sites and see who's running those things. So it might be interesting to actually get this for your own campus and query yourself. So I think this would be useful for that. And going to other groups, we got initial interest of like, yeah, that sounds great. But there was nothing there. It was just an idea. And so I think this is maybe, vaporware 2.0. I mean, it's not quite just theoretical. Hey, wouldn't this be a good idea? There's a little something here to talk about now. So I think now going out to organizations, they'll see what we're doing, and it might solicit a little more interest and participation. But the other thing is we need to find the funding for it, because I don't want to show up on Curious doorstep and say, hey, will you do all this work? And you got to foot the bill. So we are reaching out to Ithaca SNR to help put together a formal research project that is looking at this. And I'm going to be very embarrassed to hand this over, and they're going to laugh at me and call me a nincompoop. But at least we've got something to start with. And then with that proposal, we'll be able to go out and hit up organizations to provide support, hopefully, for it. And then we can go to the communities that expressed interest to say, okay, now we can actually support you in supporting the project. Anything else? No? And look I'm giving you like 2 minutes left. Or no, 15 minutes left. How much time? 2 minutes, okay. All right, well, thank you very much.